You're listening to Trust Talks, the podcast that brings you real stories and insights from people doing incredible work in our community and beyond. From everyday experts to extraordinary collaborators, whether you're here to learn, get inspired, share a laugh, or just enjoy some honest conversation, we're glad that you're tuning in.
Welcome to Trust Talks. I'm joined by my colleague Matt, and Matt, hello.
Sorry?
Matt, you're on your phone. We started the show
Are we rolling? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, let me put my phone down.
Okay, no. Thanks.
Sorry, I was just
well, that leads
engrossed.
that leads on very well to this topic because we are discussing addiction, but not just your conventional addictions. We're looking quite closely also into addictions that can affect our mental health without us realizing how harmful this can be.
We're talking about addiction to your phone, and we're going to be talking about addiction to your social media, and I think we're also going to be talking about addiction to gaming as well.
Yeah, well, that's one thing I'm not addicted to for sure.
Okay.
Maybe Pac-Man, like I've said once before, but that's about it.
Perfect. Let's dive in. A very good afternoon from sunny Southampton. We've brought our portable studio down to Bargate today, and we're joined by our special guest, Dr. Konstantinos Ioannidis, to talk to us about some less conventional addictions. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Dr. Konstantinos Ioannidis. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and clinical lead for the Southern Gambling Service with a base in the College Quay in Southampton. Also an honorary senior clinical lecturer at the University of Southampton. Well, quite excited to be here with you today.
Thank you very much.
Well, welcome, Konstantinos. Thank you for joining us today in this topic.
So we're talking about addiction today. A lot of people know about drug addiction, alcohol addiction, but then there's other ones that we don't necessarily think about that we take for granted on a daily basis, like technology. I feel like sometimes I'm a little bit addicted to my phone.
Yeah, so true. I mean, sometimes you even drive back home to fetch it if you've forgotten
Literally.
it.
And so what actually defines an addiction?
Yeah, that's very interesting points you raised. And of course, drug addictions, alcohol addiction, they're so important to understand and address, and they bring so much harm to society. So they're very important not to forget about those things. But, I will actually counterpoint your suggestion that we don't talk about addictions in behavioral addictions and technology addictions, because I actually think it's one of the most commonly discussed topics these days, especially among parents. It's one of the most common conversations that parents would have over concerns.
That is true. Actually.
How much,
Yeah. So true.
Parents would always discuss about how much time their kids are spending on iPhones and their tablets and playing games. And of course, as they grow a bit older and they reach adolescence, then it's like boom, social media and the whole extravaganza of stuff that are coming your way. If you're a parent and you have an adolescent child, I mean, you probably know what I'm talking about.
You can probably tell I'm not a parent from my misguided assumption that we don't talk about it. But that is very true. I do remember my mum, when I was a little kid, she'd be like, "You're addicted to your PlayStation."
Yeah.
Or TV. Remember, you have controlled TV time.
Absolutely. I mean, going back to your original question, what defines addiction? I guess a simple way to describe addiction is that addiction is when someone cannot stop doing something, even when it's harmful to them. It might start as a strong habit or a need that they're trying hard to control and they find it's very difficult to achieve. But ultimately, it affects the person's body, mind, and their daily life. And this element of loss of control is key characteristic of all addictions, substance addictions and behavioral addictions as well. And the fact that the person cannot stop this behavior, even though they might try to stop and they can't, or even they go the other direction, they escalate the behavior or they expand on what they do with this particular troublesome behavior, despite the clear presence of harmful things that happen to their lives. So this might be they fail academically, or they have vocational troubles with their jobs, or they experience body aches or other physical symptoms or mental health difficulties. And, depending on what sort of behavior we're talking about here, let's forget substances for a while, but thinking about behavioral addictions, depending on what type of behavior you're engaged in, you're potentially exposing yourself to a whole array of harmful consequences.
What are sort of like the warning signs of addiction?
So are you asking warning signs for the individual or for people around?
If you're a parent, where's the line between?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's different for everybody. But sometimes the person who engages in a particular behavior, they might already know themselves it's quite problematic, but they might find it quite hard to stop. So one of the things that might happen is that the behavior starts to become secretive. The person might be quite avoidant to talk about it, or they might take elusive action to be able to carry on with the behavior without being seen. These could be early signs that the person actually realizes they shouldn't be doing that, or maybe the environment starts to pick up that they may be engaging in this behavior more and more. This may be becoming problematic or might lead to friction within the family. And then it's possible that they might take some sort of elusive action not to carry on with it, but not avoiding the conflict in the family about it. So these could be warning signs, but sometimes there's no warning sign. Sometimes the behavior may be happening. The person may realize that they have lost control over what they're doing, but their family environment, they don't know about it.
That's a very interesting point, Konstantinos. I mean, I was also recently looking at some research around what we're talking about now, just focusing slightly on the social media addiction. It seems that quite a lot of youths are experiencing this feeling where they do feel a bit overwhelmed, but they're not really sure maybe how to deal with it. What advice or guidance would you give those that are facing that but think, well, what could I actually do about this?
Yeah, I guess, again, this is a quite complicated question because it applies differently to different people and different ages, really. And social media is not one thing. Social media is multiple different things, and the way people engage in social media varies. Some people, they use social media in their careers. Their careers are built around media accounts and all that. And, it's not easy to say whoever spends X amount of time on social media, that is problematic. When you want to establish that something is misused or that something is an addiction, I think it is important to be able to have a demonstrable harm to the individual or people around them. So with social media, it's quite complicated because the harms that come from use of social media are not often direct. Like in someone engages in gambling behavior, they might risk losing their life savings or their pension fund or, their house.
Right.
They might be driven to criminal behaviors. So, the harm is quite easy to demonstrate in some ways. But with social media, sometimes the impact is more nuanced. We know, for example, that young people who spend increasing amounts consuming image-based content, they might start developing more, awareness of the difficulties around their body image, or it might lead to worsening body dissatisfaction. And that its own means that, their mental health is impacted in that way. That may have a lot of downstream effects in what they might try to do to address that, but ultimately it might lower their self-esteem or might lower their mood. While some of this is early findings in the research that you mentioned, I think we can quite safely say that heavy consumption of particular strands of social media may negatively impact on young people's mental health.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure, there are quite a lot of practical things one can do that can support that, limiting your use of social media, maybe deleting some apps on your phone that you feel that you're obsessed with in a sense.
Yeah, I think something that everybody can take as a takeaway message would be, if you find yourself thinking that you may have been using a particular social media avenue quite heavily, be mindful that this can potentially be hazardous to your health. And not everybody realizes that. I think sometimes many of these behaviors are normalized. People now grow up in a society where everybody is on their phones, and that's the new normal. if you said to someone like 50 years ago that people would be walking around with phones and they might not be aware of their environment as they walk, and they might be run over by a car because they were walking while they were looking at their phones, they would not believe us. They were thinking that we were talking about some, outlandish
Like another
scenario.
world.
Yeah, no, totally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But everybody being mindful of how we consume technology, I think, is an important takeaway message. The same way that we should be mindful of what we put in our bodies, in the food that we eat, and the water that we drink. We don't want the water that we're drinking to be polluted in any way. We want to be exposing ourselves to good content. And the other thing that is quite important in that sense is trying to understand our usage of online technologies under the lens of an opportunity cost. What I mean by that is, say young people are spending time on social media, or they stream, or they play video games, or this is time and energy and effort spent in that avenue. It means that time or energy is not available to them to do something else, to spend time with friends, to pick up a musical instrument and learn how to play music, to do a sport. Okay, you've spent such amount of time and effort to, stream or follow a particular media account. You don't get the opportunity to do something else. And we don't really know the impact that this will have to our society and, the next generation. But I've mentioned the young generation quite a bit, but I think I should also mention that behavioral addictions and everything that will fall under the umbrella of problematic usage of the internet, in that sense, problematic usage of technology, is not a problem of the young age.
No, not at
alone.
all. No, it's our society.
It's our society. The elderly people can also be very vulnerable to overuse many of these technologies, and there's all sorts of harms that can bring as well.
Considering how easy it is to access some of these services, if you're watching TV, I regularly see gambling adverts.
Absolutely.
Or it's very, because of the way technology is, it's very accessible these days, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is not about our service specifically, but this is our bread and butter. We treat people who come forward with difficulties around gambling, and one of the common problems, specifically in the last 5 years, has been the fact that back in the days, if you wanted to place a bet or play the roulette, you have to physically walk into the casino, and then when you're out, it's done. You don't have access to it. You go to bed, and that's it. But now people have a casino in their pocket, and it's there, open access to them every day, all day. And the same doesn't apply just for, I mentioned casino games and roulette, but the same applies to sports betting. Those things, they become available to individuals 24/7, and this is a different type of addiction.
It's like a level of control, isn't it?
Yeah, the level of control. I mean, being able to control your impulses is very important. A lot of the theoretical models of addiction place a lot of emphasis in understanding difficulties in inhibitory control. That is, well, you have a thought, you think, I have an urge to go pick up my phone and check my social media account, or go on a betting platform and place a bet. The brain should be able to have this ability to inhibit some of those thoughts that come to our heads, urges or cravings. But in people who have developed addictions, often this degree of inhibitory control has been undermined. And it might be that for various reasons they were predisposed to have that. There might be other factors that may be sabotaging this, like life trauma or other parameters, social disconnectedness, loneliness, that may play roles in these processes. But ultimately, being able to build again this capacity for, being able to control cravings and urges is an important part of the recovery journey away from an addictive life.
What would make, for example, here in this room, there's three of us, what would be a defining factor that would cause one person to develop an addiction, whereas another person would have they do not have addictive type personality?
So First of all, the concept of an addictive personality is quite controversial. When we try to help people overcome their addiction, we try to de-emphasize the idea of an existence of an addictive personality per se, because it's a bit controversial because it implies that there's something fundamentally broken with these people that is possibly unfixable, and they need to accept the fact that they have to live with their addiction in one way or another. And in many cases that's not how things are. Also, sometimes predictors of one type of addiction are not predictors for another type of addiction. So again, this undermines the notion that the person has an addictive personality, so it has to be nicotine or then alcohol or then gambling or then social media.
Yeah.
Having said that, there are some predisposing commonalities between various types of addictions. For example, a predisposition for impulsivity, which may be predisposing the person to actually seek sensation-seeking characteristics in the personality. They might be seeking novelty, or they might be more susceptible to develop what we describe as cue reactivity. So the brain becoming much more easily triggered towards a particular item, say substance or behavior, and then be much more prone to build a particular unhelpful habit. And then once the person goes into this cycle of developing a habit like that, then in many ways this does change the brain. So if then we follow that person down the line of, say, a few years, having repeated the same behavior again and again, there are changes. They have changed. So while much of this could be reversible, what is difficult to disentangle here is the changes that we see down the line. Did they always exist, or are they a consequence of the addictive habit? Which makes, some of this discussion, quite interesting, but also quite hard to disentangle. What has come first, Is it the personality that has changed, or is that the consequence of the addictive behavior?
I just wanted to touch on the gaming industry, if that's okay. Gaming is quite often seen as quite a harmless entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
People do become addicted to it, and you have like in-game purchases which are quite controversial in that you end up paying for something that actually has no material value to it, and people become fixated with Farmville. You paying to have your chickens lay their eggs quickly or whatever. Like, do you think the gaming industry needs to look at the way it's operating, or do you think they have a responsibility to?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. First of all, I will specifically refrain from making specific mentions to particular games and particular apps, but as a general comment, the answer to your questions are yes and yes, in that yes, the gaming industry should take on the responsibility of how they develop their games much more seriously, and the fact that harms exist within the engagement with games and online games is not something that should be taken lightly. A lot of this is pitched as entertainment and harmless content for all ages. Down were the days where, video games were for 8-year-olds. Now this is an all age entertainment process. There's games for everybody. Where does the harm come from? So first, the harm can come from the fact that you spend too much time on the particular app. So if you spend too much time and energy on this, you don't get to do other things that you need to be doing. That might be schoolwork, or it might be your work or your vocational roles and all that.
Family life.
Other life roles can be impacted by the fact that your time and your energy is actually spent on this particular video game.
So it's causing a bit of an imbalance in your life.
Exactly. But you also mentioned something that's very dear to the things that keep me awake at night, and the key interest of my particular strand of research, which is the intersection between different types of problematic internet use. as some of the research that we have done looks at how different types of online users interact with each other. And we firmly believe that if we want to understand any type of these problematic behaviors, say it gambling, gaming, pornography use, social media, buying and shopping, you have to have a more holistic understanding of how those intersect with each other. Because now we have giant gigatech companies that move so fast and they feed between each other. So there's what we call gamification of gambling, gamblification of gaming, gamification of pornography use. And it's so this example that you bring up, you have gamers that will spend a fortune, and by fortune it might be like the whole all their pocket money and more, to buy a skin for a character in a video game that they play. And well, the other guys at school would do the same, and everybody seems this is an acceptable thing to do, and they might feel peer pressure to get the best skin. Or the other thing that happens is the loot boxes. So loot boxes in-game purchases, effectively, they don't operate very much different to gambling. You buy something which is an uncertain reward behind a curtain of unclear probabilities. So if that is not gambling, then what is? But then it happens is people, they, as you say, they can't get addicted to those products. They might end up spending fortunes on those products, and but they're not regulated, and it's very hard to regulate these products because policy making takes time and legislation takes time, and this is a very fast moving sector. So by the moment you find a way to do something about X, there's Y and Z, and you're always lagging behind.
Yeah, the companies are already ahead of you in terms of what they're doing. Yeah, it's that dopamine effect, isn't it? It's the gratification of, for example, the loot boxes.
Yeah,
you might win something big.
I mean, I refrain from like, as we said earlier on, churning into like
of course
neuroscience stuff. But we know that there are particular areas of the brain that are quite key in the addiction process. Yeah, there's a center in the brain, the nucleus accumbens, and it's quite key in processing reward signals. Dopamine is a key chemical in the brain that is involved in these reward processes, and many types of addictions, either the substances and behavioral addictions, seem to give us this signal. When we scan people's brains in particular tasks using functional MRI techniques, we see that some of these areas, they show specific reactivity, and indicating that people are much more reactive to, say, a gambling specific stimulus that activates those areas of the brain. There are other brain areas that are actually also involved in behavioral addiction paradigms, like the frontostriatal pathway, and some other chemicals that also seem to be important, like the glutamate, which is involved in learning and memory, and also helps in processes of inhibitory control. So that's another. I mentioned earlier on that one thing is the reward experience, the pleasure, getting the kick out of the sensation seeking, getting the kick out of the behavior is one thing, and being able to stop and control the activity is the other thing.
And that's where it sort of ends up spiraling.
Exactly. So there's an interesting theoretical model of behavioral addictions. It's called the I-PACE model for short. Effectively, what it describes, and what I like about this model, is that it differentiates between early stages of addiction and later stages of addiction. So very often in someone's trajectory in life, in which they may have engaged with an addictive behavior over a number of years, people can actually describe two different phases that they may have gone through. And it's not the same for everybody, but for most people, when they start doing something which then later on leads into problems, they may say, oh, in the first it was fun. The first stages are very much characterized by impulsive action. So impulsivity drives the person to pick up a chemical substance or a gambling activity, and then they find it quite gratifying. It might be quite enjoyable. People might say, "Oh, I went into a casino, walked out with 10 grand."
Mm.
That's probably like the worst thing that can happen to somebody, because it really primes their brain into thinking, "Oh, I can do this.
Yeah, I can do that again.
Yeah.
I can do that anytime." And then ultimately what happens is cycles of chasing losses,
Yeah.
and the brain is wired in such a way that records the one big win much stronger than 20 small losses. So even you might be losing money, you might just recall that you have won so much in the past. But going back to the I-PACE model, initially there's impulsivity and there is a lot of gratification that drives this from repeating the behavior. As the behavior becomes more chronic, then there is this habit formation process, and ultimately what we may call compulsive use. And in that compulsive use, the person may actually not be driven by the reward or the pleasure, the gratification aspect of the activity, but more rather than they feel quite distressed when they don't do it, and they feel like they are alleviating this distress when they actually engage in the activity. And despite the fact that they feel like that, they still cannot stop, because many of these behaviors are now ingrained into the brain, and it's quite hard to stop that cycle.
I think we've nearly run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for talking to us today, Konstantinos. It's honestly been really, really interesting. Just before we wrap up, what's one bit of advice you would give to someone if they thought that they might be struggling with an addiction, or if they're a member of a family, if they're listening to this podcast and they're thinking, "Oh my goodness, maybe my son's addicted to gaming"? What would be your...
I think the first, if they're worried about themselves, I think there is help out there. So reaching out to professionals might be one thing to do, but also for family members, start the conversation in a non-critical, non-judgmental way would be the first step to do.
That's such an important step, isn't it? Because like you say, people can often in those spaces become quite angry or, scared, and then that can come out, and the space is not a safe, welcoming space.
Trying to understand why this is happening, and sometimes those behaviors, they might be implying other things that are going on. There might be difficulties that relate to a general mental health problem like depression or anxiety, and over focusing on the specific behavior that seems to be problematic might be trying
like masking something
else.
Okay.
So kickstarting a conversation about that. How is the person feeling? What troubles them? What are stressors are in their lives? And then kickstarting a conversation with them, as I said, in an open, non-judgmental way.
Oh, thank you so much, Konstantin. That's been really insightful and such an interesting discussion. And thanks for sharing your insight and passion into this subject.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Matt.
If any of the topics discussed today have resonated with you, or you feel you need a bit of support, you can reach out to your GP, or there are a number of charities that support with mental health and the effects of addiction.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we would love to hear your feedback. You guys can get in touch with us via social media. Just search Hampshire and Isle of Wight Healthcare, and see you next time.